Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to this morning's presentation. I'm Carl Carlson, like John Nelson, an emeritus professor of English, which I'm sure most of the people in the room would agree is the best department in the college. I'm going to try and show you how much I admire John and tell you what about this book I love, and my hope is that at the end of the hour you'll both admire John and love the book. John taught in the English department from 1971 to 2002, a good run. I started admiring John the first morning that I came to a faculty meeting my first year. He had a ponytail, and I had cut mine off in the hopes of getting a job. It was a trick that worked, but I couldn't help but envy his that first morning. At department and faculty meetings, I admired John's capacity to speak up, offer an opinion, sometimes, if not often, dissenting, but always insightful and articulate. I admired John for his receipt of the NIZOD Excellence in Teaching Award. I admired John because after retiring, he served on the Board of Trustees from 2005 to 2012 and was chair for 3 terms. I admired John because back in the day he played tackle football without pads in Gloucester, something that is clearly nuts. I admired John for his book, Cultivating Judgment, the source book for teaching critical thinking across the curriculum, which was published, I think, by the college in 2005. Those of you keeping track of trends will recognize those catchphrases, which perhaps might be not in so wide use these days. I admire John because right now he's teaching a course in writing nonfiction at the Gloucester Writers Center. I admire John for his aspirations in writing. Early on, back in the day, he told me about his aspiration to write the great American novel, a novel about sex, drugs, and rock and roll back in the 60s and 70s. I think he's returning to that quest. I guess he never heard of Gatsby. I admire John because back in the day he told me about his aspiration to create an encyclopedia of birds in American literature. It seemed like a huge and unrealistic project, and I kind of nurtured the hope that maybe he would outsource to me Birds in Kate Chopin's Awakening. But in fact, what has happened, I think, is that aspiration has morphed into this book. And if you read the book and if you read the chapter entitled Sympathy, you'll see that there he treats birds among 19th century Massachusetts writers, Dickinson, Hawthorne, Melville, Bryant, Longfellow. I'm sure you recognize most, if not all, of those names. I admire John because his essay, Funny Bird Sex, how's that, won a Pushcart Prize in 2018. His most recent essay, Coming of Age in Samoa, has been nominated for a Pushcart Prize this year. Pushcarts are, in a sense, Pulitzer Prizes for small presses. I admire John for his prize-winning writing. I love his book. I love that he's humorous and humble. In one excerpt, he says, each June, Jim and I lead a trip at Cranes Beach co-sponsored by the Brookline Bird Club and the Essex County Ornithology Club. Actually, Jim leads the trip. I tag along as his quippy sidekick with a scope. I love the way Mary, his spouse, is all over this book, woven into the narrative, a true partner in his adventures. I love that he talks about biking and birding while biking. I've taken a number of bike rides with John, and I realize now how tolerant he is because, as he writes, if you don't stop to look at the birds, you're pedaling and just wool gathering. On our last ride, we stopped at Meadowlark Farm Lane, and John proceeded to tell me about how all of these cul-de-sacs with McMansions are developments that have in fact driven out birds. And one of John's worries, as he points out in the book, is that bird habitats are being overdeveloped and are disappearing. I should mention that John is the director and field trip leader for both the Brookline Bird Club, the Essex County Ornithology Club, director of the New England Journal Bird Observer, and in 2016, how's this, he founded the Association of Massachusetts Bird Clubs. I love the way John takes me into the world of birding. Over the course of the book, he describes his progressive immersion from novice to expert. I kind of feel like an expert too at the end of reading the book. At the same time, I never feel talked down to or as a newbie. His chapter, Watching the Gulls with Emerson, describes a tour of a birding tour of Gloucester, which is a nice introductory orientation. I love the way John inserts his travels around the world in search of birds. Just a handful of places: Mongolia, Gambia, Guatemala, Senegal, Bolivia, Thailand. I love the way John schools me on how a birder works, the work it takes to identify birds, the zeal that propels him to seek birds out that are yet unseen, the pursuit of the sighting of a rare bird. I love John's scholarship. I love the way he weaves throughout the book quotes and references to influential birding books. It's an education and a pleasure to read the way he's integrated this information into his essays. I really admire John's writing. I love all those bird names. Sometimes I feel overwhelmed as if I'm in Hitchcock's movie, The Birds. Black-poll warbler, black-capped chickadee, Caspian terns, lesser black bakewell gull, white-winged crossbills, Wilson's philanthropes, lazuli bunting, rose-breasted I probably have slaughtered those names, I'm sorry. Finally, I love the way John's writing makes me think of Thoreau. They are both really naturalists and champions of their own locality. John's description of how full of life the birds around his home are just up the hill from Wingersheek Beach in Gloucester reminds me of how full of life Thoreau's Walden is. And when Thoreau claims that through the global water cycle, water from Walden evaporates and is carried to the clouds where it's delivered throughout the planet, Thoreau mentions the Ganges in India, I think of John's essays and how they make me realize that birds and their migratory patterns connects us to the far reaches of the globe. Like Thoreau, John shows us you don't need to go to the ends of the earth. Everything is right there at your doorstep. Kind of cosmic. Cosmic, too, is the state of mind John evokes while birding, present in the moment, focused on the soundscape of the natural world, listening for bird calls and on the lookout for birds, on the cutting edge of awareness and perception. What John calls the naturalist trance, quote, the ability to stay attuned to the slightest movement, sound, or shift in light. So there's a lot to admire about John and his writing. There's a lot to love in the book, and I bet you'll feel the same way in an hour.
Thanks, Carl. Carl is a good friend, longtime colleague, and accomplished oral historian. I have to say, I really like the guy because he, at least as far as I know, he says such nice things about me. So I appreciate it. I would have a ponytail, but I lack the wherewithal. And actually, my essay currently in the Missouri Review is Coming of Old Age in Samoa, which is partly why I don't have a ponytail. So this is the cover of my book, which is the talk about today, Flight Calls Exploring Massachusetts Through Birds. It's a collection of essays. I'd say a wide-ranging collection that brings together my personal experiences with birds, journeys across Massachusetts, journeys back in time. It's a mix of history, literature, science, and humor. I will read some passages, and I'll promise to read them out loud. The title of the book, Flight Calls, has a literal meaning, referring to the calls that birds make when they fly, which can be a way to identify birds, especially at night. And it's also a key to understanding bird communication. But it also has a metaphorical meaning, which I play on in my introduction, the idea that the flights of birds and the calls they make beckon to me. They call to me personally. Their eye music, their ear music, and I think what captures this is from a Spanish photographer, Yave Bu, who does what he calls chronophotography. This is the flight of one bird in a series of pictures. He tries to capture the patterns. He published a collection of his photography in National Geographic in 2018, and each bird, each species forms its own pattern. Some look like double helixes, some look like spirals, some look like a bad hair day, but it kind of puts into an image what I feel about birds. I came to birding late in middle age, but once I got into it, I had birds in my brain to the point I actually had an x-ray taken and found there was a bird inside my brain. This is an old x-ray. I'm pretty sure the bird is much bigger and taking up more of my skull, but I just became absolutely fascinated. I didn't really start birding until I was 52, so this book is kind of a product of the transformation that took place. Part of it is the birds themselves. This is a book about Massachusetts, but there are certain birds that absolutely fascinated me. This is a bird called the secretary bird. It's named for the quills that are coming off the back of its head. This is a bird of the African grasslands and savanna. It's a snake stomper. It does fly, but it strides across the savanna looking for snakes, stomping them to death and eating them. But apart from exotic birds, this is also about a personal transformation. This is an image of the poet John Keats looking up at a nightingale. And in one chapter of the book, which is about dealing with grief and death through birding, I discuss Keats's poem, Ode to a Nightingale. But I guess I would say I found myself becoming like John Keats, and I'll read a passage about the personal transformation that took place in me through birding. This is about my early days of birding. Meanwhile, something was happening to me. So intent was I on not missing a bird, I'd slipped into the habit of absorption. The amorphous world had grown more precise. Now I was alert to signifying movements all around, attuned to sounds, an eastern towhee's leaf shuffling, a chipmunk's chip, an eastern wood pewee's distant pewee, a red-tailed hawk's scream from the sky. I was growing closer to earth, water, and sky. I'd check a bird's field marks to identify it, then I'd stand back and try to take in the bird, its purposeful movements, its attitude toward other birds, its routine. If a sparrow comes before my window, wrote John Keats in a letter to a friend, I take part in its existence and, don't have my glasses on here, and pick about the gravel. I become as concentrated as a still hunting green heron. And there's a picture of a still hunting green heron, one of our state's most gorgeous birds. So I'm going to give you an overview of the book, and it's a mix of birds, places, people, history, and I'm going to start off going back quite a ways to the 6th century. This is St. Brendan, the Voyager, or the Navigator. This is from a chapter in the book called Birds of the Promised Land, the idea that heading west from Europe, you would find some sort of promised land. has been around for a long time, long before Columbus. This is about 1,000 years before Columbus. So this is an ancient Irish myth about St. Brendan and a group of monks who were seeking the promised land of the saints. They had a number of adventures. They landed on an island that turned out to be a whale. They landed on another island that was called the Paradise of the Birds, where they found birds who were Lucifer's fallen angels and were very educated, articulate birds who spoke Latin to them and made prophecies. The main prophecy was that St. Brendan would never find the promised land, but at some future point his Irish descendants would return when they were persecuted and find refuge in the promised land. They had a number of adventures involving birds and mythological beasts and birds. This is a griffin, which is part bird and part lion. The monks were attacked by this bird and then saved by some other birds. So there was actually, not long ago, an modern Irish navigator who recreated this voyage and did make his way to North America to prove that St. Brendan's crew might have done this, although there's no evidence. So I'm part Irish. I like to believe it's really the Irish who discovered North America, not my Norwegian ancestors and not this guy, Christopher Columbus. One thing that's striking is that Columbus not only kept track of the birds he saw in North America, but it was actually a bird or a group of birds that brought him to North America. He was lost is not the word for it. He thought he was off the coast of Asia. He didn't know there was a continent in between. He was about, 6,000 miles away from where he thought. His expedition looked like a total failure. He was facing imminent mutiny by his crew because they thought they would never see land. And they saw some birds that were migrating, and it was by following these birds that they finally made landfall. Same thing happened. This is a recreation of John Winthrop on the Arbella. John Winthrop was one of the first governors of the Puritan colony in this area, and he also was lost trying to find land and looked up and saw some pigeons, which led them to land which was fairly close. And that's a representation of the Arbella, which brought the charter for the original Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So it was actually not Europeans at all who discovered the birds of North America. It was Native Americans who came here 13,000 years or so before any Europeans got here. I always thought of people discovering birds moving west across our continent, which was true for Europeans, but Native Americans crossed the Bering Strait and discovered the birds as they moved south and east, and really in a remarkably short period, they dispersed all the way from Alaska to the very tip of South America and all across North America. This is a romanticized idea of Native Americans. This is an illustration from Longfellow's poem, Hiawatha. Probably the bird that appears most often in the mythology of Native Americans and probably in world mythology across the circumpolar regions of the whole continent is the common raven. This is a picture my wife Mary took at the Great Salt Lake with the raven kind of overlording it. There's endless myths about ravens. In some myths, ravens created the universe. They're major figures as totem. And I would say there's a great variety among Native American tribes, but for almost all of them, birds were important as both food and as totems for what they spiritually signified, ravens particularly. This is yours truly with a couple of ravens at the Tower of London. And one myth that appears in different tribes in the Northwest is the idea that ravens were once white, and the myths explain how they were turned black. This is actually a photo from last year at Vancouver Island in British Columbia of I think the formal name is leucistic. This is a common raven that's lacking pigment, so it's turned all white. So it's bringing these ancient myths back to life. This is a representation of the great epidemic among Native Americans in our area from 1616 to 1619. Excuse me. This epidemic probably involved smallpox, but maybe a collection of diseases. It's not known for sure. I'm using this because I'm not going to talk much about Native Americans and birds in this area because what we know is very sketchy, and it's because of this epidemic. One historian said that the New England epidemic was one of the most dramatic population reductions in the history of the world. It was followed by several wars, so that by 1700 there were very few Native Americans left in this area. You know, there are artifacts, there are Europeans who describe their involvement with birds, but the record is very sketchy. In other places like the South, we know much more about what birds meant to Native Americans. So what we do know about birds in the early history of North America comes from a series of explorers and settlers. This is Jacques Cartier, who landed in Newfoundland in 1534. This is a colony of northern gannets from the maritime provinces. And in all the accounts, especially the very early accounts, the Europeans who came here were just astonished by the abundance of birds they found, especially in comparison. Even by this point in history, a number of bird species were declining in Europe. This is a northern gannet's eye view of the world. This is two great auks. This is one of the species they found, and I'm going to read a passage that expresses this sense of abundance they found. In Newfoundland in 1534, Jacques Cartier found island cliffs turned white by legions of nesting gannets, flightless great auks, these birds, wonderfully plentiful, fat, and easy to kill, and waterfowl swarming in such density that all the ships of France might load a cargo of them without one perceiving that any of them had been removed. Champlain, who I'll come to momentarily, describes such plenitude of birds that one could not imagine it if one had not seen them. This is a map drawn by the explorer Samuel Champlain. This is Cape Ann. He was the first explorer to land from Europe, to land and describe and map Cape Ann. He called it Beauport, which is a name you'll still see for Gloucester, meaning beautiful port. This is a plaque at Beauport commemorating his landing there in 1606. This is on Rocky Neck in Gloucester. This is Champlain trading with Native Americans, and he's got one of the few, perhaps the only, first-hand European description on Cape Ann of the Native Americans there. And I'll read a brief passage about that. A plaque marks the spot where Samuel Champlain put ashore in 1606 to get water for his crew and called the place La Beauport, beautiful port. In the only first-hand European account of Cape Ann's Aboriginal settlers, Champlain described Pawtuckets dancing on shore in what he thought were Portuguese clothes, and he claimed that they danced better after he gave them some knives and biscuits. He drew a map depicting habitations and garden plots around Gloucester Harbor, and at his request, the natives drew an outline of the coast up to the north. One of the things that Champlain noted, this is an ivory-billed woodpecker, now generally considered extinct and never native to this area as far as we know, but he found the bills of ivory-billed woodpeckers that had been used in trade from tribes in this area with more southern tribes. So there was indication there was extensive trade and bartering. He and others also described Native Americans wearing earrings made out of hummingbirds and kind of a number of other curiosities. And like many others after him, Champlain was just astonished by, to his eye, the weird birds that were in North America. This is a black skimmer, which is named after its flight. It skims along the water. Champlain saw these birds in Nauset Beach on Cape Ann. Couldn't understand how birds with beaks like this could possibly eat. But I think that reaction of just there were birds here that were nothing at all like what they knew in Europe. Champlain was followed by Captain John Smith, who's most associated with Jamestown, but he actually wrote a book about his travels to New England in 1614. He was the first Englishman to compile a list of birds in North America, the first to map Cape Ann. This is his map of Cape Ann, and I could go on forever about Smith. I'll put it this way, he's not exactly a reliable narrator. He's probably reliable as far as his descriptions of birds and timber and fish, but he was commonly ridiculed on the stage in England for being a blowhard and sometimes an outright fabricator. One thing that's striking is that most of you probably know the story of Pocahontas, but Cape Ann was originally, this is a hard word to say, but named by Smith Cape Tragabigzanda, which is named after a Turkish princess that rescued him, much as Pocahontas did. And there was another princess, Lady Kalamata, on the steppes of Europe, who also rescued him. So there's a suspect theme running through Smith of being rescued by beautiful brown-skinned women who were in awe of him. In fact, he was ridiculed in one play as the White Othello, telling tall tales of his travels. I've often had fantasies when I'm on Cape Ann looking at seabirds of being out on Smith's ship and wondering what the world looked like from his point of view. He would have seen what looked like a wilderness of forest along the coast, but he does cite some of the birds. He saw this as a bufflehead, which is so named because it's supposedly buffalo-headed looking. I have my doubts, but they're also called spirit ducks, which captures their liveliness and their sounds, and I think a more appropriate name. This one took some research. This is a horned grebe, which is fairly common off our coast in winters. It's also a bird that's in Europe. Smith calls this bird a dive topper, and I couldn't figure out what the hell that meant, although they dive, but so do many other birds. But I finally tracked down dive topper as a reference to grebes in Shakespeare. So he saw some of the same birds that Shakespeare saw. Smith tried to be reliable, but as he said, he often didn't know what he was looking at. He didn't claim he saw this. This is a griffin again, but one word he uses is grip, G-R-I-P-E, which is derived from the same root as griffin, is an all-purpose term to describe birds of prey. So he saw a lot of birds of prey, but it's often hard to tell what they were, and he admitted that. And just, I'm sympathetic with him. He's, long before modern binoculars or bird guides. This is an illustration of the common birds of prey in North America, so you can be sympathetic with Smith's difficulty in trying to tell all these birds apart. One of the more interesting early accounts is from David Ingram. David Ingram wrote a book. He was an English sailor who was on a slave ship that was delivering slaves. The ship sank off the coast of Mexico near Veracruz. According to Ingram, he and several crew members walked all the way from Veracruz, Mexico, along the Gulf of Mexico, up the eastern seaboard, and reached the Canadian border. Whether that's true or not, who can say? He did have reliable reports of birds he saw, like great auks, but he also claimed to have seen elephants, which, as far as we know, weren't around at the time. And he saw these other animals he called unces, and to this day, nobody knows what the hell an unce is. But one bird that got everybody's attention among the European explorers was the ruby-throated hummingbird. The hummingbirds are endemic to the Western Hemisphere. There are no hummingbirds in Europe. One observer called this a miracle of all our winged animals. Many of the early observers confused hummingbirds with insects. This is a photo my wife took of a hummingbird moth out west, so it took them a while to realize that hummingbirds were, in fact, birds. The first bird that was named, and I guess I'd say the first bird that was misnamed in North America, the first songbird that was named is the Northern Mockingbird, which was called the Virginia nightingale. Nightingales, like mockingbirds, sing a lot of different songs and are varied, but they're not from the same family. But people love this bird for its singing, just it's out and about. Mockingbirds aren't bashful. They'll sing, they'll play, they'll fight. So this is a bird that quickly became popular. One mockingbird lover a little later with Thomas Jefferson, who, when he was in the White House and before, had a pet mockingbird named Dick. This is a sketch of Jefferson and Dick. Now, this is actually early 19th century. This is a painting of a turkey shoot, and people who came here, both explorers and settlers, didn't come here to look at beautiful birds. They were struggling to survive. And the most common theme that runs across early reports in the 17th, 18th century is birds as food. Turkeys were shot in such huge numbers that there were already reports that they were declining as early as 1672. Protein was hard to come by for the early settlers. This is a painting of pilgrims during a winter period of famine. So they weren't simply killing, slaughtering turkeys for the hell of it, but they were often facing starvation, and a high percentage of the early settlers, especially the pilgrims, died during the first few winters. This book illustrates the idea of birds being hunted for food. This is William Wood's New England's Prospect from 1634. One thing he does is he has a list of birds and he notes the ongoing market price for each bird. So this bird, for instance, this is a green-winged teal, a beautiful bird common in our state in winter. You killed one of these, you could sell it for 3 pence at the time. Wood, like some other observers, was more opinionated and impressionistic than scientific. His descriptions of birds are actually written as rhymed poems, but some birds he just didn't take kindly to. I don't know why, but this is a common loon with a chick, which he considered a very ill-shaped bird. He also goes on about how bad cormorants taste. And although I've never tasted a cormorant, I've talked to a couple people who have, and nobody has recommended that you eat a cormorant, so I wouldn't do it unless you really like a fishy taste. This is a painting of killing of passenger pigeons. which kind of the most famous bird from this period, which crossed the skies in such numbers that people described flocks that would take a whole day to cross over, hundreds of thousands of birds. The term stool pigeon actually comes from passenger pigeon because hunters would tie birds onto branches to attract other birds. That's where that term derives from. So they were killed in massive numbers, often wastefully. One other bird that was not used for food so much, but considered a threat, a pest, is this bird. This is from Mark Catesby's catalog of North American birds in 1722. This is a bobolink. These birds were loved for their joyfulness, for their bubbly song, but also viewed as, not so much in this area, but viewed as pests, as eaters of rice crops. Here's a more modern photograph, really a beautiful bird, one of the treasures of our area, and still common. And it won't get here until May or so, but you can go out there and see bobolinks. I'm going to close up our historical venture. By the time of the American Revolution or so, you start to see a wide trade in birds as pets. This is a painting from 1805. This trade was often harmful to the birds. One example, these are two Cuban macaws. The species is now extinct, but after his first voyage here, Columbus brought macaws back to Spain, and that helped to start a pet trade. Hummingbirds were often brought back to Europe as pets, and almost all perished, usually before they even reached Europe. Okay, we're going to move from our journey back in time to visit a few places to go birding in Massachusetts. I cover quite a lot of the state. I'm going to focus just on two. One is the Great Marsh, which extends from Gloucester north along the coast into New Hampshire. This is my neighborhood in West Gloucester. This is nearby, this is from Canomo Point along the Essex River, looking across the Essex Marsh. This is a photo my wife took at sunset. This is my wife, Carl mentioned her, the photographer. Here she's feeding chickadees at Ipswich River Wildlife Sanctuary. This is a great blue heron, and I'm not a native to this area. I've always loved ocean, but the longer I live here, the more I've come to love salt marsh, and I'm going to read a passage that tries to capture that love. Might help if I actually put my glasses on. I start this by describing a very nice book by John and Mildred Teal called Life and Death of the Salt Marsh, about the tides reaching inland and life reaching inland, and then this is my wording. It's this reaching and creeping I love, life grasping for footholds, the endless rise and fall of water, the marsh inching inland and receding, the boundaries ever shifting, plants ever colonizing like eelgrass, capable of complete submersion, animals finding homes, a world in flux. On a gray mudflat under solemn clouds, the sun comes out and transmutes a mud puddle into a reflective pool of sky, shining cloud, and a great blue heron lifting off. Mary is by my side, light passing through her hair. Feeling swoops into space inside me. Around us, ocean flows into bay, estuary into river, marsh into solid land. Each day is as changeable as the seasons, each season distinct, the sumac reds and matted grass chartreuses in autumn as beautiful as our maple forests. That's what the marshland means to me with all its birds. One of the birders called them spark birds. One of the birds that sparked my interest in birds is this. This is a glossy ibis, a common bird of marshland in our area. They started arriving here in April. I actually, after a series of orthopedic injuries, I took up bicycling for exercise. I bicycled by one of these. I was astonished. Actually, I was embarrassed. I'd lived here a long time and didn't know these birds existed. It looked like something out of ancient Nubia to my eyes. Also, in my early bike rides, I saw this bird. This is a little blue heron. So these are a couple of the birds that transformed me into a birder. Another one, this bird is declining in our area because of a decline in grasslands where they can live. This is an eastern meadowlark. This photo was taken by Phil Brown at Cogswell's Grant in Essex, which is one of the few places remaining in Essex County with a good chance to see this species. One of the treasures of the Great Marsh is Crane Beach. This is an overview of Crane Beach. This is truly one of the wonders of our state. If you've never been there, I suggest you go. Each year, Jim Barry, who's here, Jim Barry and I lead a trip. You actually quoted, I'm Jim Barry's sidekick on these trips. Before sunset, we spent a couple hours walking along the beach. One of the things we're looking for are piping plovers. This is a photo of a piping plover with several chicks underneath it. That's why all the legs. And one of my more memorable birding moments on one of our trips, some friends of mine brought their daughter, who was about 6 years old. She wasn't much interested in birds, but we had a spotting scope set up on piping plovers like this with all these legs, and we raised her up to the scope. It took her a while to realize what she was looking at, but her whole face lit up in wonder at what she was seeing. The Great Marsh, and actually the whole North Shore, has a long history of landscape and seascape painting. This is a famous 19th century painter, Martin Heed, who loved the Newbury marshes. This is one of his paintings of the marshes in Newbury. This is another Heed painting. This is one of my favorite places to bird by bicycle, just riding through the marsh that he so loved. One of the birds I look for, there's a place along the Raleigh-Newbury line that sometimes has this species. This is a Wilson's Phalarope. It's a type of shorebirds. It's recognizable partly by its spinning movement as it feeds. This bird is interesting for a couple reasons. It's a beautiful bird. This is a female. But this bird, along with a fairly small number of species, illustrates a sex role reversal. The females lay eggs, but the males do all the incubating, all the feeding, while the females go off to find other males to mate with. So it's a reversal of traditional sex role. I've never found a woman ever who didn't love Wilson's Phalaropes or all Phalaropes. This bird, I find is comical, was a mystery to early ornithologists who thought this bird couldn't be a female because it didn't act like a female, or their ideas of it. So there were long explanations of how, no, this couldn't be a female, but others pointed out, well, they do lay eggs, which is a dead giveaway with any bird. This is one of my favorite, maybe my favorite place to bike ride. This is me on the right. This is the Brookline Bird Club. We have an annual birding by bicycle trip in May on Plum Island. One of the species we look for are ospreys. Ospreys, along with some other species like peregrine falcons, were in serious trouble because of pesticides which thin their eggs. And as a result of Rachel Carson's book, The Silent Spring, in 1962, a lot of these species have recovered, so you'll now see ospreys around the state, often on man-made osprey platforms. And one of my favorite birding stories involved the species. I went to Plum Island one spring to see if the ospreys had returned to their platform nest, because they're at the same nest every year. And this very excited couple came running my way, yelling, "Bald eagles, bald eagles." on the platform nest. So I pointed out that this is known as a traditional nesting platform for ospreys. Nope, nope, bald eagles. So I got my binoculars and my scope and got to view the platform, saw 2 ospreys. I took my Sibley birding guide out and in great deal pointed out all the differences between ospreys and bald eagles. Nope, nope, bald eagles. So I finally set up my spotting scope at 32 magnification and said, you know, take a leisurely look, bald eagles. So some people just won't pay attention to evidence. There's too many wonderful birds at Plum Island, but I'll give you a taste. This is one of the characteristic birds of the marsh. This is a northern harrier. This is a marsh lover. They glide across the marsh. You go to Plum Island this time of year, you've got a good chance to see one of these. Another bird harder to see, but being seen this year usually around dusk, is a short-eared owl. This is the owl above fighting with an American kestrel. And actually, the main rivals of short-eared owls are harriers. It's not easy to have the opportunity to see them, but I've witnessed a few prolonged battles over territory, feeding territory, between harriers and short-eared owls. 2 other birds I'll mention. At the end of the book, I talk about conservation. One bird that is in serious trouble, maybe more serious trouble than any other local species, is this bird, a salt marsh sparrow. As the name indicates, they only breed in salt marshes. They're not able to adapt to other environments, and rising sea level is gradually drowning their nesting area. So I've talked to biologists who I asked, you know, if you had to ask which Massachusetts bird might be extinct in 50 years, this is one that's mentioned. Now, these birds aren't going extinct, but one of the glories of our state is each fall there is a tremendous migration of tree swallows. I went one time last year, we were trying to count them. We gave up after 10,000. This is within a few minutes. One of my most exhilarating experiences, which I describe at the end of this chapter, is bicycling through a horde of tree swallows. And if it conjures up images of Hitchcock, it's not like that. I wasn't in danger, but there were so many swallows. Cars were stopping, photographers were stopping to take pictures of them, so I was riding along in the midst of maybe 3,000 tree swallows. I'm going to take you to one other place in this journey across the state. This is Mount Auburn Cemetery, which is on the Cambridge-Watertown line. If you've never been here, this is also one of the true wonders of our state. This is one of those places where, for me, it all comes together. It's a beautifully big landscape garden. There are birds there. It's known as a birding hotspot because it's a migrant trap, or kind of an oasis in a city, so especially during spring. It's famous for its sculpture, and it's famous for the people who are buried there, who can give you a tour through American history. It also revolutionized graveyards in our country. It might seem odd to go birding in a graveyard, but they're among my favorite places to bird. And this was created as a garden cemetery, and instead of a kind of place of doom and death, a place where people could commune with nature, have their spirits uplifted, and also gather. It was open to all, rich, poor, regardless of race. At one point, this was the 3rd most popular tourist attraction in our whole country. So it's still a wonderful place to visit. And every time I go there, I'm just struck by how the history of the place, the people buried there, find some way to connect to birds, and I'll illustrate that. When I taught here, I used to teach a book by Harriet Jacobs, who was a slave who escaped and eventually came to New England. This is her gravestone, and it reads, "Patient in tribulation, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord." This is a copy of her book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Well worth reading. One of the most striking parts of this book, she was being hounded by her owner, hounded sexually and every other way. She already had kids by this point, and she faked an escape and instead spent 7 years hiding in a garret, a type of attic that was so small she couldn't stand up in it. This is 7 years. Only her grandmother knew she was there. She drilled kind of peepholes so she could look out at her children playing and hear them playing, but they had no idea. They thought she was gone. It's really a remarkable story, and I've often thought, she doesn't write about birds, but I've often thought she must have heard birdsong and just what that might have evoked for her. We don't know, but the day I visited her gravesite, I heard singing above me and looked up and saw this bird. This is an indigo bunting, which breed here each summer. Mount Auburn is famous for its sculpture. This is often called the Copenhagen Angel. The sculptor is Martin Milmore, famous 19th century sculptor, and it's partly a famous statue because the feather patterns on the wings are very intricate and show a real knowledge of feathers and actual birds. Nearby, this is the monument to Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of Christian Science. There's actually a funny story I tell in my book. While they were building this monument, people kept reporting hearing telephone sounds, telephones ringing. And there were speculation about Mary Baker Eddy communicating in the spirit world. But there was a more mundane explanation. It turned out there was fear that the site would be vandalized or damaged, so they installed some security guards with a booth with a telephone. So it wasn't her. But the day I visited Harriet Jacobs' grave, I walked over to the Eddy site. This is the bird I saw there. I had heard it singing. This is a great crested flycatcher from a very large family of birds in the Western Hemisphere. This is probably the most famous statue in Mount Auburn. This is the Sphinx that is part woman, part eagle, part lion. This is a Civil War monument. The inscription reads, "American Union preserved, American slavery destroyed, by the uprising of a great people, by the blood of fallen heroes." Short distance from this, on this day, I saw this bird. This is a Canada warbler. And this book I connect to my brother. I have a chapter in my book about death and birding, which was set off by, I'm the last of 7 children. In a 10-month period, my 4 surviving siblings all died, one right after the other. I flew to Canada, where my brother lived, to deliver a eulogy. And I was out, as I was out walking through a weedy field, I saw this bird, so I don't ever see a Canada warbler without thinking of my brother. Mount Auburn has long been a popular place to go birding. This is, I'm part of the Brookline Bird Club, which goes far beyond. It started in Brookline, but is now the largest club in Massachusetts, one of the largest bird clubs and one of the most active in the country. This is from a Brookline Bird Club group in 1960 at Mount Auburn. It might seem strange, but if you go to Mount Auburn in the peak of spring migration in May on a warm, sunny Sunday, you might see 200-300 birders wandering around the cemetery. This is one bird this is actually would be quite a, not rare, but uncommon sighting. Hooded warbler. This was taken by a guy named Bob Steinmetz, who's led so many trips at Mount Auburn that he's now known as the mayor of Mount Auburn. When I first met him, I wondered if he actually lived inside the cemetery. This is a more common warbler. You go in mid-May. This is a Magnolia Warbler. Good chance you might see this bird. Another bird you might see is the Scarlet Tanager. This is a bird I've seen in different places in the cemetery, but particularly near the Washington Tower, which is the highest point in the cemetery. Here's a northern cardinal on one of the street signs or path signs in Mount Auburn. And this is back to the Mary Baker Eddy Monument. This is a red-tailed hawk. Red-tailed hawks are our most common bird of prey in our area, but they're actually latecomers. They did not, now you'd almost always see one if you went to Mount Auburn, but they did not nest in Mount Auburn Cemetery until just after 2000, very recently. The first pair that nested there were very closely studied and named Hamlet and Ophelia. And finally, the Washington Tower, the highest point, offers a panoramic view of Boston skyline. That's Harvard Stadium in the foreground. Mount Auburn also has a strong literary tradition, and I talk about poets and other writers about birds a lot in my book. Ralph Waldo Emerson often visited Mount Auburn before it was established as a cemetery. Henry David Thoreau went there frequently, and Emily Dickinson, pictured here, made one visit as a teenager to Mount Auburn. She just loved the place. Dickinson, I've got about 5 or 6 pages in my book about birds and her poetry. One of her favorites is a Baltimore Oriole. This is actually taken in our backyard at our hummingbird feeder by my wife. But this is a very common bird in Mount Auburn in May, and surprisingly common in this whole area of Massachusetts. But like the early settlers, her favorite species was the hummingbird. When she visited friends and neighbors, she sometimes left a calling card, and she often signed her calling card Hummingbird. And this is what I mean by connections. Some people think of Dickinson as a solitary figure, but she was part of a circle of artistic friends who were bonded over their love of birds, among other things, and one of them was Martin Heed, who painted the Newburyport marshland. This is a painting by Heed of some hummingbirds in Brazil, so he's maybe most famous for these kinds of paintings. So he and Dickinson bonded over hummingbirds, among other things. This is a poem by Dickinson, which is about hummingbirds, and evanescence is a word she connects often to hummingbirds, and just simple poem capturing their flight. A root of evanescence with a revolving wheel, a resonance of emerald, a rush of cochineal, and every blossom on the bush adjusts its tumbled head, the male from Tunis probably, an easy morning's ride. And one other Dickinson poem. There's certain birds Dickinson just loved and relished at all times, not just for their looks, but for their behavior, their boldness, their song, and one of them was the bobolink. And this is kind of a light comic poem about finding religion not in church, but at home with bobolinks. Some keep the Sabbath going to church. I keep it staying at home, with a bobolink for a chorister and an orchard for a dome. Some keep the Sabbath in surplus. I just wear my wings. And instead of toiling the bell for church, our little sexton sings. God preaches a noted clergyman, and the sermon is never long. So instead of getting to heaven at last, I'm going all along. She's got one very funny poem about a bobolink who's ridiculing some very gray, drab, sour Presbyterian birds. So she had more sense of humor than people give her credit for. So kind of winding up, some of this book is about becoming a birder as old age is approaching. This is the parrot. Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. I know this feeling. Some of this Carl was talking about tackle football. I've got a few comic chapters about my misadventures or adventures while on crutches, sort of caught between physical infirmity and my drive to see birds. Probably the most foolish of these involve this place. This is Dog Bar Breakwater at the Eastern Point Lighthouse in Gloucester. And this story I'm not making up. This is me on crutches with a gull I couldn't shake. Somehow I got it in my head to walk the entire length of Dog Bar Breakwater on crutches and a cast. This is my wife. This is her idea of birding. She wanted no part of this breakwater. But though she is a nurse, in this case she was my enabler, I guess, but mostly there to make sure I didn't fall over the edge. I don't know if I did what she would do about it, but it was well worth it. These are purple sandpipers, which are here, one of the few shorebirds here in winter. They love rocks. They're often at the end of Dog Bar Breakwater. On this day, I saw 153, which is by far the most I've ever seen, and this picture doesn't capture it, but if you get close enough, which you can actually see why they're called purple, because they have this kind of lavender tint to them, and so it's well worth it. Now all I had to do was walk back on crutches. I did tell this story to my orthopedic doctor, who looked at me with his tongue hanging out and said, you know, what were you possibly thinking? And I said, birds. So I have a couple other stories about sort of birding in the face of mortality. Here's a Gary Larson Vulture cartoon. Now take them big birds, Barnaby, never eat a thing, just sit and stare. And I will say vultures are becoming more common, and there's one spot on Route 128 where I saw a vulture, turkey vulture, flying this morning. I've seen it about 5 times there in the last 3 weeks. I try to keep myself in good shape in case the vultures get at me. Sure, that is important, but it has to taste good. I just point out in passing that, you know, we like to think of ourselves, or some of us, maybe males, as descendants of hunters. But if you look at the way we live now, very few of us are going out and killing our meat. We're much closer in our behavior to vultures. We're scavengers. We just do it at the supermarket, not along the road. I have one chapter where I try to bring this all together, which is called Geezer Birding, which is about the pros and cons of birding as a geezer. And I've advertised this as a comic book, and this ties in with my former pigtail. I've got one paragraph on not so much about birding as aging. While physical problems may shrink the geezer's world, it's the social problems that most irritate. For me, the greatest is embarrassment. I know it's silly, but I can't help myself, and so I hear these pathetic stories leaping from my tongue. How I high jumped in college, played football till 50, ascended Mount Katahdin without a cane. It's the age-old cry of the old. Please believe me, I wasn't always this way. I had hair, hippie hair. I was agile. I didn't need Birders Viagra to get up a mountain for a warbler. Well, I done got old, sings Buddy Guy. Can't do the things I used to do. Or as the Who put it in Quadrophenia, I'm wet and I'm cold, but thank God I ain't old. Now, I actually shift tacks at the end of this chapter, and I talk about the fact that, you know, birders, like other birders, I have lifeless. There's birds I want to see before I'm gone. But when I'm on my deathbed, I won't be worrying about that. I don't know what I'll be worrying about. But more important than any birder's list is the question of who's going to come after us, who will carry on the birding tradition. I think I'm involved with other bird clubs. One thing we struggle to do is to recruit young birders. Richard Louv, among other things, who's the author of a book called Last Child in the Woods, has written about how more and more children aren't exposed to nature at all. The only birds I might know are birds in zoos, or birds in cartoons, or birds in video games. But partly what I've tried to do with many others in bird clubs is to introduce young people to birding. The Brookline Bird Club has a book fund. We donated money to a group called Citizen Schools in Boston. These are two girls who were part of that. And closer to home, there's a group on the North Shore called Kestrel Educational Adventures, and their mission, and they're connected to a lot of schools in our area, is to introduce young people to nature generally and birds in particular. What are we doing for time? Well, I'll quickly wrap up here. I'm going to go back. This is a panorama of St. Brendan's voyage, but I've often wondered if St. Brendan did come here now, or Champlain, or Smith, or Audubon, what would strike them? You know, some writers now describe the time we live in as the Anthropocene, which is a way of saying that humans have so taken over the earth and left our mark everywhere. There's nothing, or few places in the world that are not touched by human hands. So if they did come back, instead of living great auks, they would find this species. This is a skeleton of a great auk. The species has been extinct since the 19th century. The only passenger pigeons they would find, and passenger pigeons are often looked at as kind of the prototype of extinction. Some people estimated this was once the most abundant bird species in the entire world. They've been extinct for about 120 years now. On the other side, in some places, this is again in the maritime provinces, they would still find abundant northern gannets nesting. You go out to Cape Ann, you might see gannets flying close to shore in winter. We still have black skimmers. I actually saw some at Plum Island last year. So we still have remarkable birds worth checking out in our area. One bird that's often hard to find, but it's been very common this year, this is a relative of the great auk. This is a little auk, often called the dovekie. This species has been seen commonly along the fish pier in Gloucester and other places. And when I lead bird walks in winter, when I go to Rockport, these are harlequin ducks. I always end there because we almost always see them, and they are some of the most beautiful creatures in all of creation. They used to be called the lords and ladies of the sea. This is actually two lords, not. And turkeys, which were extirpated, which were completely gone from Massachusetts, have come back to the point where now I see turkeys in the police reports about people complaining and wanting turkeys to leave their yards. So I end the book about conservation. This is one of those cartoons that's funny and not funny. There are many factors that are threatening birds. Many species are in trouble. The biggest factor worldwide, and in this area, is habitat loss. But climate change for many species is a serious problem for seabirds. For land birds, there are birds that are gradually moving north up mountains and are running out of mountains to go up any higher. So I'll close with the very ending of the book. And this, what I'm going to read actually has this bird. This is an ovenbird. I've puzzled over how to end this book. People don't rouse easily. We've heard it all before. Doomsday warnings, guilt trips. There's no point in getting self-righteous because we have all failed to live up to our righteous ideals. Whether we own mutual funds invested in companies we'd prefer not to know about, or react to Trump's latest outrage with little more than anger emojis on Facebook. I'll save any guilt for myself. I know only that if I have deathbed regrets, they won't be about the birds I never saw, but what I could have done for people and birds yet failed to do. If I'm preaching to the choir, that's all right. Choirs keep coming together each week to sing as a community and resolve to do better as individuals. Nature is not a place to visit, says the poet Gary Snyder. It is home. Our physical and psychic health is inseparable from the health of our home. If our home becomes degraded, if we lose marshes and meadows, whippoorwills and towhees, we lose something vital to being human. In Robert Frost's The Ovenbird, which is this bird, a warbler sings about the end of spring abundance and the coming of the fall. The question that he frames, writes Frost, in all but words, is what to make of a diminished thing. Our home has been diminished, but nature keeps trying to adapt, revealing mysteries and new realms to explore. There's a story that on his deathbed, Thoreau was asked by a friend if he could glimpse the hereafter. One world at a time, Thoreau answered, one world at a time. And I'll close with a quotation from Thoreau. Thank you. Sorry I ran over time.